Are you?
Okay. Uh, Hi, welcome to the Code and Supply podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Stephanie Morillo. She's a writer and communicator from New York City, and she works in the tech industry. Stephanie, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am a technical copywriter. My background is in strategic communications and public relations, but I fell into tech around 4 years ago when a good friend of mine taught me how to program. And since then, I've fallen into the rabbit hole of loving all things tech and developers, and I now work at DigitalOcean, a cloud infrastructure provider. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I love DigitalOcean.
Yay!
Yeah, one of the hosts, Alex Shinoy, and I'm joined by co-host Emma. Emma, do you want
Hello. It's really great to meet you, Stephanie.
Likewise.
I have been part of Code and Supply for a while. I don't know. This is my second time on the as a host, I guess, on the show.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Emma. Okay, so I guess Stephanie, we'll just kind of get into it. I know that you've done you kind of have a lot of interesting things that you do. So you said you're a writer, you're a technical copywriter. You also have done a lot of things like written essays on things like diversity and tech hiring. I'm just kind of curious, like, how, for you, the journey into becoming, like, joining the tech industry and becoming, like, entering that industry, what was that like for you? Like, that.
Yeah, I want to say that I entered tech out of need, basically. When I started learning how to program, I was in between jobs, and things weren't looking too bright. There weren't too many jobs in the industry that I was looking for. Communications and public relations isn't an industry that's particularly growing, and I was working in agencies. But during my time working at a strategic communications firm for nonprofits, I got into online engagement, and one of the things that we were doing was working with a developer, a PHP developer, to basically update an entire client's website. And that's when I realized that I was really interested in. I didn't really know what a developer was. I didn't know how they differed from a web designer. I didn't understand these things, and I started talking to a friend of mine one day, and she was like, "You should really talk to my husband, Steven. Steven is a developer. He's a programmer. He builds websites, and maybe he can teach you some stuff." And I met up with Steven, and he actually got me into Ruby on Rails. That was his preferred technology at the time. And then I started meeting with him once a week for 2 or 3 hours. And I had the time because I was unemployed, so it actually worked out perfectly. He gave me an old PC that he had installed Ubuntu on. So, because I was working with Windows. I mean, my entire professional career I'd used Windows. I never used a Mac, so he was like, all right, no, we're not going to use Windows because no. So here's Ubuntu. So I'm here having to learn Ubuntu, the command line, and of course learning Ruby and all of these things. And I had my ups and downs, right? I had my times when I was like, okay, this is great, Ruby is great, coding is great, and then all the times that I got really, really discouraged, moreover, because I was learning to code with an end goal, and the end goal was to get a job. So when you add that kind of pressure to yourself, coding learning how to code and code well seems like an insurmountable task. Coding already takes up a lot of mental bandwidth, I learned, and so it was a lot of me having to learn how to program and also how to reteach myself how to take it easy. That tech is really hard. It's not that you're dumb. It's just that the stuff is kind of hard and not necessarily intuitive. And through doing that for about a year, I started taking some Ruby classes, Rails classes. And Steven was actually hired by General Assembly to develop their backend web development course. It was a 10-week course that focuses on Ruby and Ruby on Rails. And they still offer this course. And he asked me to be his teaching assistant for the first ever course that they were going to produce here in New York. That was back in April of 2013. And that's how I got my start in both tech and startups, through education tech, coincidentally.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. We kind of there's this whole sort of movement now about everybody needs to learn how to code, and it's something that we've talked about on this show a little bit before. It sounds like you started learning how to code. You weren't trained in coding through school or anything, so you started out from a different track. Do you think that was like I guess how was that experience? You said it was a little bit rough to start out sometimes. I'm just wondering, like, do you think that that is a way that people can pursue, or how do you view that whole aspect
For
of it?
sure. When I first started out, I remember telling myself over and over again how I wish I could go back in time and tell 18-year-old me that computer science was the way. But I also came to terms with the fact that a lot of my education and my learning really didn't gear me towards that track. I grew up thinking that if you were going into STEM, you had to be a genius. For me, anytime I'd hear kids major, if I ever interacted with somebody who majored in STEM in college, I remember thinking, wow, this person must be really smart. They must know something that I just don't know. There was really no way 10, 12 years ago when I was in college to know that tech would be what it is today. So in that sense, I think that it's totally fine to come into it as a mid-level professional. And in fact, I think it's a great thing. I think it's an encouraging thing because a lot of us still have this belief that when we graduate from college and the job that we go into is going to be what we're going to do for the rest of our life. Like that's going to be the defining, that's going to be the thing that defines everything you're going to do for the next 50 years that you are a productive citizen. And I think that encountering tech at the point in my life that I did really helped me appreciate it because it was something that I really just wanted to do. It was something that I didn't know I had the capability of doing. And I think it's always beautiful when a mid-level professional, and I think this is especially true for people who are much older, who are already 20, 30 years into their careers, and they come into coding and they're like, wow, tech is really interesting. I think what it does is that it rekindles this curiosity, this love of learning, and it really says that it really, I think, gives people the opportunity to reinvent themselves. And frankly, I think that my experience working in a different industry helped me come into tech with a much more nuanced worldview and just a view of what it's like to work in different environments in general. I still primarily do writing for a living, and that's what I did when I graduated from college. I was a writer, but I write for a very, very different audience in a very different industry, and what I learned was I could take the knowledge that I acquired, learning how to code and interfacing with software developers, and be able to use the skills that I already possessed. I was able to marry the two. I didn't have to just leave one completely for the other. And even then, like my interests have changed substantially based on where I work now. I don't do much. I haven't done much software development coding at all. I would say in over a year. I'm really out of practice, but I've started falling in love. Falling in obsession. I'd say I'm kind of obsessed with like anything to do with system administration now. Servers are fascinating to me. Deployment is fascinating. I really like networking. Like this is like, I know I'm doing things like the complete opposite way. I feel like it's like you start off with networking and IT and then you go into software development. No, for me it was the complete opposite. But that's also the fun thing is, as I think as people progress in their career, in tech, so it doesn't matter what point you come in, you're always going to start piecing things together, and the picture will get bigger and clearer, the further you go along.
I think that that's a good point to bring up. I feel like whenever I was going into school, I came from a sort of traditional background of like going to school, going to college or whatever, and learning more stuff. But I also had a lot of experience on my own, like outside of classes and whatnot, learning. But I think that I know that my supervisor at my old job and one of my coworkers at my, like one of the, more senior people on my team now at Travis, both originally had anthropology degrees.
Yeah.
And they, just sort of got into it. I think that there's a stigma almost against like you said before about getting a computer science degree. Even specifically a computer science degree, a lot of the things that you might learn in that degree you might not use. I think that it's becoming a much more generalized thing, and sort of like Alex said, we all we're all being sort of pushed in this direction of like learn how to code and everything
Yes.
like that. Everybody is being pushed into the tech field because I mean even and especially even coding, you know, whenever it comes to like the system administration stuff and whatnot that you were talking about, I mean
Hmm.
that's where I came from, and then even so, all of that stuff is still managed by code at this point. I mean,
Right.
all of the networking stuff is just somebody's application that simulates those things between a bunch of VMs at this point. So, um, like that stuff can be really hard, but then uh, there's such a broad. It's almost people say like working with computers as if it's like this generalized topic, and it's actually
Yeah.
like like most things at this point are all in that field, and there's a place for someone who's an experienced writer to be. I am 100% positive that if I wrote about something and you wrote about something, you would do way better than me because I don't I am not good at that, and that was one of my sticking points in school, and whatever. So yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do want to go back to the comment that you made about how you viewed like people that would go into computer science as they had to be super geniuses, because I think that that's something that does a serious disservice to our career. And it like there's this thing that's put out in the industry where it's like we're looking for a rock star developer and we want a
Yeah.
rock star A plus, like we want we want somebody that like is just amazing in everything they do. And I think that that sets an unfair standard. Like I would never call myself a rock star, right? Like I would just it's not something that I would do, and I feel like that one it automatically like turns people off, but I think it also not just from that job. I think it also turns people off from the entire field because it's like, oh, this is such a like if you're not the most amazing programmer ever, then these companies don't want to touch you. When like I feel like it's not true. Like of all of the programmers in the world, maybe like 5% of them are these super rock star genius types, right? But like most people are just writing, a web service or something, and they're really smart. Don't get me wrong, they're really smart, but they're not like they're not doing like nuclear physics or something to make the website.
Right.
So I thought it was an interesting point that like that I feel like that stigmatizes the field a little bit. And also is somewhat of a barrier to entry for people that want to come in. So I guess, do you have any thoughts on that specifically, or how that is evolving, or?
Yeah. I mean, I can just talk about it based on how that would play out in my head. How I felt, how I just learned how to I internalize instead of just saying, okay, this, instead of questioning the fact or acknowledging the fact that the material was really difficult to learn, because programming for me in particular was not very intuitive, and even for the folks that are really 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 smart, they still hit a wall. Everybody still hits a wall, and I, instead of just recognizing that, I internalized that, and I was like, there has to be something with me. Maybe I could have done better with math when I was younger. Maybe if I was, because I mean, technology is still part of STEM, and I think when people talk about the sciences, and we revere those kinds of folks because there aren't a lot of them around. We know that there's a lot of work involved in order to acquire those skills, that knowledge, with reason. I mean, tech, engineering, science, like these are fields that require that level of detail and attention to detail. So it's not that thing is necessarily, it's not that kind of reputation is, I would say, like not like mal-earned or whatever, but I would think that if people really understood what a website was, like the reason why I think there is this whole like you have to be a rock star and a genius is because a lot of people don't see the magic. They don't know what's behind the screen. They don't actually know how these things run. We don't, and technologists, we don't do a very good job of communicating it to people. We don't really tell people how the internet works. We don't really tell people what goes into building a web application. And I don't mean we have to go into like 100 million steps, just like on a very basic high level, what is a web application? I mean, a lot of people don't know the difference between a web application and a website, but for a developer it would be obvious. So a lot of things that are obvious to technologists are not as obvious to end users who don't have a technical background, and certainly to people who aren't really aware of the field. You know, I remember when I first saw the command line, I remember seeing like all of the green, you remember the Matrix, like when you'd see the computer with all the green stuff like coming down the screen? That's what tech is, you know, and you see movies and it's always somebody, you know, just like furiously going away at the keyboard and typing out a whole bunch of stuff that ends up in coherent words, and something happens. And because of that particular kind of culture, and then of course, you know, we have the myth of the person who has been programming since the age of 12, you know, that's the text version of the Mozart Wunderkind. You know, Mozart's been writing, you know, all kinds of crap since he was 6 years old. That's like our equivalent of that kind of myth, that methodical figure. And I think that having that is problematic because it doesn't make it approachable. We should say, yeah, tech is hard, but it's approachable. There are many different avenues to learning tech. Tech is not just building websites and web applications. Certainly that is a huge thing because we interact with those things day to day. But there are actually a lot of other components that go into tech, into the web. And I think that is also an issue, the fact that we have not done a good job of communicating the actual tech ecosystem. I mean, I didn't know what other people there were there aside from software developers. I didn't know. Yeah, I sort of knew what a network was, maybe not really. I didn't know that there were people that were administrating a network. I didn't know that there were people engineering a network. You know, that all of these things. And then as I start learning about all of these different pieces, when they start falling together, I get mad at myself because I'm like, duh, that makes sense. But I don't know what I don't know. And the public doesn't know what it doesn't know. So if we did a better job of communicating what we do, what different careers are out there, I think people would start to feel, they'd start to see themselves in something. Because not everybody who goes into tech or has an interest in tech wants to be a software engineer. And neither should we push people to go solely into the software engineering. By software engineering, I mean almost exclusively web developer route. So if we continue, I think, to offer this myopic like view of what tech is, and then if we continue to surround it with all of these myths, I think it does make it hard for anyone who would have an interest but wouldn't know where to start to feel that maybe there's a place for them there.
Cool. Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit. I know that you've done a lot of community development, things like that. And I know that you've also you've written about things like diversity. You've written about things like how privilege is tied with privacy. I was wondering if you would want to talk about those things as well.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything specific you want to talk about, or just like in general?
Just in general, like your view approaching those topics, because I feel like they're topics that are becoming more like they're becoming more forefront, I guess. And just your experience with tackling them.
I think that a good way to segue into that would be, we're talking about getting into tech and whatnot, but there are still it's easy, and it's easy in some ways because there are a lot of resources out there, and I think a large number of people like sort of knew a friend or something like that who could sort of help them really get excited about these things, or even meet up groups like Code and Supply. But there are still diversity barriers to a lot of those communities. And I think that the work that you've done is really important. But please, from there.
Thank you. Yeah. So what got me interested in it's interesting. Like now, when I think about my writing, I really do think about where I was in my journey in tech at that particular time, and that's kind of what I started focusing on. So one of my first pieces, I think my first piece was about feel-good stories, like how the tech industry rallies behind feel-good stories, but those aren't sustainable. And I think I used an example of this one man who he was homeless here in New York City, and a young entrepreneur offered to teach him how to program, and he taught this man how to program. And I remember how it was like all the rage a few years ago. You know, he was in the newspapers and the media, but after the media died down, I learned that maybe a month or two after the last article that had been written about him, he was still homeless and he was still looking for a place to live. And I just remember thinking how the story and the path to tech, or to a career that is, that can be lucrative, it is a career that can really help people get gainful employment, is still not very easy to go into. I mean, when I started working at a startup, there were very few people of color, and that in particular, I mean, when it comes to people of color in particular, that is always something that strikes out to me, because I identify as a person of color first. So I just remember thinking, wow, they're not a lot of us here. This is kind of hard to get into. And then as time went on, I realized that not only am I one of the few women of color, I'm one of the few native New Yorkers, who works here. I'm one of the few XYZ who works here, and I started to see that too in the greater tech community as I started participating and going to conferences and things like that, to different tech conferences. People are generally, I think most people that I've encountered anyway, are really well-meaning and really wanna get the diversity question right, so to speak, and that this is a problem that a lot of people want to solve. A lot of people want to see solved. It is not a very easy thing to tackle, and even in my work, in my writing, in my community work, I find that it's still difficult, because I myself am learning. I have to recognize privileges that I have over other people, and that's not always an easy thing to do, and it's not always easy to come to terms with that, or find it's just really messy. It's really hard, I think, to make sense of. I write a lot about it, but I can't tell you that I understand it any better now than I did in the beginning. If anything, I think now that it's just a lot more convoluted and very messy, just because I've worked in it longer. But I think that nonetheless, it is a worthwhile effort, and I do hope that people in tech start seeing diversity as more than just a check mark to tick off, and also to take people who do work in diversity, to take them seriously, especially the people that devote themselves to it. I don't consider myself a diversity expert whatsoever, but I do care about it, and I know that there are people that have created careers out of helping, with policy, corporate policy, helping companies with diversity initiatives, all kinds of stuff. And I think that those are people who we need to tap into, and we need to frequently bring into this conversation a lot, because they definitely have perspectives that a lot of us don't. And I think that when we start seeing them as another part of the tech ecosystem, of the tech industry, I hope that that'll begin to change the conversation, and hopefully we'll start seeing more positive change.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the topic of diversity is pretty near and dear to me in some ways. Coming from the queer woman angle and whatnot, which there's a lot of stuff about as well, but that's another podcast. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. Coming into my old job, I think I was like one of 4 women on my particular on my floor of the building or whatever, out of like 50 people or something like that. And definitely the only one in infrastructure. And that's a pretty common thing. And the ratio was even worse as far as people of color were concerned. And that's really sad to see. It was, and that's the average company. It's funny because we get sort of there's at least a lot of awareness in the startup sphere and in the sort of like online super connected sphere of everything, but a large number of tech jobs still remain to be the ones that are not where we're, like where I've already heard of you, I already follow you on Twitter, and then, all of those things, and I have friends who know you and whatever. So it's almost, I don't know, it makes you realize that it's a much bigger issue whenever you can sort of stand back and look at like even in our somewhat more idealized, still not very idealized environment, we still don't have, it's still a major fight and, not fight, but struggle, and something that we need to be mindful of. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Sorry, Alex, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no. Sorry.
So I don't know. I've had, to be honest, recently I've had to just step back a bit from the diversity conversation, or even like talking about it frequently, because I've noticed like how that affected my mental health. Just like always being. I feel like it's also. I feel like the problem that I encountered was that I felt like, as a person who was of an underrepresented group, that the onus was somewhat on me to bring up these topics and to talk about it and to bring it up. And I've gotten to a point kind of where I'm a little tired of feeling that I have to be the person to talk about it all the time, which makes me sad too, because I feel like it's not that I don't care about these issues. These issues affect more than just me. They affect all kinds of people. So these are issues that I care about very, very dearly. But I've also had to learn to step back from the conversation, because it can be something that is potentially engulfing. It takes a lot of, like, I remember just spending a lot of time talking about it, thinking about it, working through it, talking about it at conferences, through my stuff with Women of Color in Tech Chat, all of that stuff. And then I started feeling that all of my focus and my attention was going towards that conversation, and I didn't feel, I felt like I was expending energy and I wasn't conserving any energy, and I wasn't actually spending time doing the things that I really wanted to be doing. So I've actually given myself a bit of permission I've given myself the permission to just not be as involved in the conversation. I feel that too, being an observer, really allows me to learn. So if I'm just listening, I can listen to other people's, to other groups, to other people's issues and concerns. I don't always have to comment about it. I don't always have to be the person with an opinion on it, because I'm not a diversity expert. This is something that I want to make clear. It's not something that I do professionally. And I think that they're professionals. They're people like Nicole Sanchez of GitHub, like Ash Dryden, who do an excellent job of this kind of work, and they understand it on many different levels. And I think that I want to talk about it, but I also want people to know, hey, there are people that are actually working on this, and they're doing really great work, and we should bring them into the conversation as soon as possible. So I think that's the posture that I've taken recently.
Nice.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. Not to belabor the point or anything, but
no, for sure.
Yeah.
It's I don't even, I followed some folks like Ash and whomever, even whenever I was in school, and by the time that I got into tech, I was sort of like just trying to like into the actual industry out of school and out of whatever. I was already sort of trying to, because and I've seen a number of other folks sort of do the same sort of thing where it just gets to be a whole lot.
Yeah.
So I can't blame you, is I guess what my point is, and I will stop pushing it after that.
Yeah. I think I get this thing at work sometimes where I'll just like put some talk on like in the background. Like I'm not actually watching it. I just have the audio or whatever.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that I did today, I was listening to Kent Beck's Ease at Work. I don't know if either of you have seen it. He talks about just being comfortable at work, but one of the things that he opened up with was somebody had come up to him and said, like, I feel like I have to leave parts of myself, like I have to cut off parts of myself from entering the office. And that was kind of like, I guess, in the forefront of my mind as we're talking about this, is that I feel like that's kind of not a position that you want to be in.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
So I guess let's go back to talking about telling tech stories, I guess, like telling the story of technology. And so you work at DigitalOcean now.
Yeah.
Do you like, what are some tools that you use to try and help tell that story for DigitalOcean or for companies or places that you've been at in the past?
Yeah. The story of
like just like the story of technology as you see it, because you also blog about like beginning web development and resources that you use. So you blog about a lot of different things. I'm just wondering, what are some of the things that you found that are easy ways to help tell that story in your writing?
Yeah, what has been helpful has been trying to do something and messing it up completely, and then figuring out how it works, and then writing about it. That's seriously how that's actually when I realized that I wanted to be a writer working in technology. Not necessarily at first I thought maybe a technical writer. I'm not a technical writer, I'm a copywriter, but nonetheless I'm a writer who writes for a technical audience. And I realized that what I really loved was trying to figure out how something worked, not working, it breaking apart a lot, and then finally figuring out, and then I'm like, okay, I'm going to write about it, and I'm going to try to help somebody, with a little humor, inject a lot of humor in it, because it is kind of humorous, and hopefully, someone will get value out of it, because what I love writing and blogging about is I like things being clear and concise. I want people to know that you're not the only one that this has happened to. And I also love that I don't know, one of the things I like about tech and the stuff that I have to do my day-to-day, because I do have to actually know how to use the platform. So that's why I've been tweeting a lot recently about Linux and networking and all of this stuff, because I'm trying, like everybody else, to, get a web server running, and then, have a firewall, because I don't want somebody in Turkey. Like today, by the way, I figured out my server logs, and somebody from Turkey was trying to break into my server, and I flipped out. And, like this kind of stuff, and I'm just trying to figure it out, because if I figure it out, then it's easy for me to communicate that to an audience who presumably has a certain level of technical knowledge and is coming, going to the DigitalOcean website to learn a little bit more about, our products or whatever. So one of the things that I'm really excited about my job is that my job really is to learn, and it's to learn as much as possible so that I can then communicate that to people in a very clear way, similar to how our technical writers, are tasked with having to figure that out and then write out the tutorials and the articles to help you get, whatever it is that you need to get up and running. So yeah, I think that's what I love about it, is that I think it's the writing about that keeps the focus on the learning and the experience of the learning and the joy of learning, because it's not always easy. It's often very hard, and I think what makes it hard too is that I'm the kind of person that's afraid to ask questions, but then learning how to overcome that just so I can figure out this problem, and then feeling elated when I finally figure out this problem, and then feeling like, wow, this person was so awesome. They helped me through this problem that I thought I couldn't get past. So that's what I think I really love about my job, and what I love about being a writer in tech. And I think that's why a lot of developers blog. I really hope that's the kind of spirit I would love to see more projects inject into their documentation. That like, wow, we figured out this thing that was really, really cool, and we know it's going to help you, and I'm going to show you how it's going to help you and why it's going to change things for you. If we saw that kind of attitude, I think people would understand why their writing is so important, why documentation, for example, is so important, when you look at it through that lens. So I don't know if that answers your question. That was kind of like
no, that definitely does. I really like the idea of like fostering this sort of culture of learning. Like I really like that a lot. It's really interesting that you said like so much of what you do is you learn by breaking things, because that's basically like that's the thing that I tell people all the time. I've become kind of the resident Git expert,
yeah.
and people all the time are like, "How do you know this?" And I was like, "I messed up a lot. That's how."
Yeah.
like you're seeing it now. You should have seen it like 3-4 years ago. It was bad.
Yeah, and then you get excited to tell people how it was that you figured it out, and then it becomes a story. I think that's why I try to keep my blog posts as story-like as possible, because it helps me remember it, and it also keeps that feeling of excitement alive in my writing. So breaking things as much as possible and then documenting it. And I would recommend that anyone who works in tech do this, and it doesn't necessarily need to be something that somebody else reads. Particularly if you don't feel that you're a strong writer, it really is just more about yourself, and to just encapsulate that feeling of how it felt to finally get past whatever obstacle it was that you got past. Because I think having that feeling is extremely important, especially when you're trying to help other people, or if you encounter the problem again, you're like, okay, what happened the first time around? How was I feeling? How did I get past it? All right, cool. Like now I have context, and now I can hopefully get past it.
I think that's one of the great things about something like shameless plug Code Supply. It's
not really a plug anymore if it's on our podcast.
I mean, I've given a couple of talks, even about really basic things, because I realized that and I really enjoyed Alex's Git talk some time ago. It was really cool and informative, and I was the Git expert at my job, and I had given a similar talk sometime before that, whenever they were just moving some stuff off of Subversion to Git, and yeah, I really like that idea. I've been on my own just trying to push myself to any time that I figure something out, or I feel like I know this thing like relatively okay, I'm like, I should make like a blog post or like a screencast or something like that. I'm really happy to see that a lot of people do that. I feel like a screencast would probably work better for me in some cases, or whatever. I mean, even like you were saying before about networking or whatever. I gave a little thing about networking because I understand it really well, but I talked to other people who I considered to be very, very smart people who were like, I learned a lot from you in this thing. Even, sort of like you said before, we developers don't do a super great job of explaining how everything actually works in like a web application. I think that's even to each other, and that's partially an okay thing. I mean, it's less stress in some ways, but it's also sometimes it's nice to have a more generalized, knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's just more like a general knowledge and awareness versus like this is exactly how every single component works, because that's just not feasible. It's not possible. But I think it's nice to know like what other things touch upon whatever it is that the thing you're doing touches upon, and it just goes to show that there's so much to learn. And I think that's also a very encouraging thing too for beginners in tech, when they come across people that are really, really knowledgeable and have really like deep domain knowledge in one particular area, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have that deep of a technical expertise in other areas. So when beginners realize that, they're like, okay, great, so that doesn't mean that I have to know every single thing that there ever was about technology. I can still focus on one thing. but have like a general knowledge or understanding or awareness of, other aspects. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting landscape in general, and it's
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, I like that Justin always says, like, at every Code and Supply event, pretty much, he says, like, you should come, like, if you're thinking about giving a talk, you should come and give a talk, because everybody knows something that other people in the room don't know, and, like, they would find interesting. So, like, everybody has something that they can teach somebody else, right? And so I really like that kind of, I like that specifically as a call to action for people to give talks.
Yeah,
So
that's
if you're
great.
listening to this, give a talk.
Awesome.
But all right, we are kind of getting a little bit close to time, so I'm gonna sort of throw it to you, Stephanie, to do like any kind of plugs. Where can people find you on Twitter, your blog, everything?
For sure.
I was gonna say real quick, just if you want to say a couple words about your singing career, because that's really
Oh yeah,
cool.
that's right. You're a musician too.
Yeah.
I cover that. Okay.
I was getting ready before it. I was like, Stephanie Morillo, and Google's like, check out Spotify, and I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's
So
dope.
yeah, that's true. It's something that I've kind of been like hiding a little bit recently, but not so much. So
Sorry, I mean,
I actually no, that's totally cool. So I actually, it's funny. It's only recently that I've started to see myself as a musician second. It used to be first up until about like a year or two ago. But I started out singing classical music when I was 14, and I thought that I wanted to go into opera. I was then 24 and realized, okay, I don't really want to go into opera as much anymore. So I started gigging and just performing around New York, doing like a lot of bossa nova, jazz kind of stuff. And then, I started working on a music blog. So I worked on a music blog that was based out of Brooklyn for about 3 years. And when I was living in Malaysia, I worked at a music magazine. So I had the opportunity to just like hang around with a lot of musicians. And when I came back, I started working on my own music. And in December of 2014, I released an EP, and I did a music video, and I did like, I put out like all the bells and whistles for that. But yeah, music and singing is something that I've been doing since I was about 6 years old, so it's something that's very near and dear to my heart. I think singing was the thing that really, really helped me dream and really helped me kind of get out. Like, I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up in the inner city. It wasn't so great back in the 90s. And singing and music in particular really helped me kind of escape that. It was like my escape. I always thought of myself as, being famous one day. I've since grown, and those aren't the dreams that I had, but I love music nonetheless, and it's something that I do for myself mostly now. I did perform though at a Brooklyn JS, a JavaScript meetup, this past summer, which was really cool. So in between talks, I'd come in and I'd sing some tunes with a friend of mine who's performing guitar, which was really, really awesome because I was like, wow, this is the first time that I've ever done anything musical in a tech space, which I thought was really, really cool. So yeah, music. I'm on Spotify. I'm on Bandcamp, stephaniemorillo.com. You'll find all the musics there, all of my stuff that I've ever put out.
That's really cool.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I completely I know we had talked about it beforehand in the Slack, and I had completely missed it. So I'm glad you stopped me before I closed out the show. But that is awesome. Definitely, everyone should go and check you out on Bandcamp and Spotify for sure. And you're going to be at the Abstractions Conference, so
I am.
Everyone will be able to see you there and come hear you give an amazing talk. And I guess, so now I'll do the thing where I'll throw it to you, and you can give people Twitter and websites.
For sure. On Twitter, I am Radio Morillo. That's RADIO MORILLO. You can find more about me and the stuff I do at Tech at portfolio.stephaniemorillo.com. And my email, you can always reach out to me. I'm friendly. I don't bite. And yeah, I'd love to hear more from you.
Awesome. Thank you very much for being on the show today. We really appreciate it. We're looking forward to having you at Abstractions. I'm Alex Shenoy, and you can find me at Alex Shenoy pretty much everywhere. Emma, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I'm at Endandrim, all sorts of places. Yeah, it's really cool meet you and talk to you, Stephanie.
Yeah, you too.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we will be back next week with another podcast.
Oh, boy. It's
Yeah.
going to be great.
I think. I'm pretty sure there's one next week.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Yep.
Thanks.